Well, David, a little bit of a hard act to follow there, but we'll move on to the
A
second
little.
program.
Just a little. Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks, Mark. I mean, it's a huge pleasure to be participating in this webcast and a privilege to follow such a distinguished economist as Mr. Sachs.
Well, you're not without your own accomplishments, sir. So let me describe them for the participant. So we'll be moving on to a discussion about transport and mobility, which is episode 6 in this IRP series. David Ward is our second guest and speaker. He is the president of the Towards Zero Foundation, a UK charity that is promoting safe and sustainable transport. The TZF manages the Global New Car Assessment Program, the Stop the Crash Partnership, and the Commonwealth Road Safety Initiative. Among his many accomplishments, David was for many years Director General of the FIA Foundation, which under his stewardship donated something like 100 million US dollars or pounds, I'm not sure, to promote safe and sustainable transport projects in countries around the world. From 2006 to 2015, he was the Secretary of the Commission for Global Road Safety and played a leading role in establishing the UN Decade of Actions for Road Safety, which concluded last year. From 2010 to 2012, David chaired the World Bank's Global Road Safety Facility, and in 2009, he led the creation, and this is one we're very proud of, in UNEP, he led the creation of the Global Fuel Economy Initiative in partnership with UNEP and the International Energy Agency. So earlier in his career, David was the Chief Policy Advisor to a British Member of Parliament and worked for the United Nations Children's Fund, as well as doing a stint as a journalist. So David, can I turn over to you and ask for you to share with participants your views on future transport and mobility? Thank you.
Mark, thanks so much. And as I say, it was this great honor to follow Professor Sachs. And today I'm billed to talk about transport and mobility, but I want to focus particularly on the motor vehicle. I was very struck by Professor Sachs's advice that we don't have any, and also that he was a bit reluctant about making future forecasts. So I sort of share, there's this famous Niels Bohr, the Nobel laureate in physics quote, that prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. So I kind of want to talk about what we want rather than what might be. And yeah, as you mentioned, I now help run the Towards Zero Foundation. We're a UK-based charity working broadly on sustainable transport, particularly on road safety and around motor vehicles. We strongly support zero road deaths from both road crashes and pollution, and we're completely signed up to implementing the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And with great help from the Bloomberg Philanthropies, the FI Foundation, the particular project we've sort of more well known for is the Global New Car Assessment Program, which has been doing safety and other ratings, consumer ratings of motor vehicles around the world. So this gives us, I think, a fairly unique, independent perspective on the challenge that motor vehicles play within sustainable transport. And of course, there's many other aspects to transport, aviation, maritime, and so on. But in a way, the motor vehicle is the big challenge, which I think Jeffrey Sachs sort of highlighted. So I think it's probably a good idea to dwell on that. Probably the most thought-provoking thing is that just in the last 20 years of this century, there have been 1.4 billion new automobiles produced. And in 2017, we reached a peak level of production of 97 million vehicles. So there's an awful lot of them out there. And the global fleet in use is the highest it's ever been. It passed 1.3 billion in 2016, and it will not be too long before it's reached 2 billion. The fleet doubles roughly every 20 years. The other thing which very often gets overlooked is motorcycles. The motorcycle fleet is already 1.1 billion, and 80% of that is in the Asia Pacific region. There's about 100 million new motorcycles. So we've got relentless growth in 4- and 2-wheeled motor vehicles. And this has gone on not exactly uninterrupted, but relentlessly, despite 2 major interruptions this century. So we had the financial crisis of 2009, and of course, the current COVID pandemic. In the financial crisis, there was a short-lived, fairly steep reduction, but then a significant bounce back, and you can actually see that in the graph. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Under COVID, it's a steeper fall than in 2009, but it also looks like it's a V-shaped recovery, albeit over a slightly longer period. So despite these major global shocks, we are still experiencing the highest level of motorization the world has ever seen. And this has sort of defied those who predicted the end of the auto-industrial age. Back in 1974, the economic historian Emma Rothschild wrote a book called Paradise Lost, and there's a wonderful quote in there where she said, "The auto-industrial complex is no more than a temporarily dominant but mortal mutation of economic evolution." Well, 47 years later, maybe unfortunately, the dominant role of the automotive industry seems unstoppable. And so, regardless of how much we might want it to be, the notion that we've reached sort of peak car is really unproven. And I think what's often overlooked in this situation is there's been a huge radical shift in the geography of automobile production, particularly over the last 2 decades. And today, the business of building motor vehicles is mainly carried out in middle-income countries. 11 out of the top 15 vehicle producers are based in these emerging markets. And of course, if you look at the numbers of automobiles per 1,000 people, they're far lower in middle-income countries than in mature markets of high-income countries. So there's a lot of potential unmet demand. And so that is really the true dynamic of the automobile industry at the moment. And it represents an enormous challenge for everyone interested in getting on a track towards sustainable transport. Now, to help frame the policy priorities for the next decade, earlier this year, the Towards Zero Foundation produced a series of global production scenarios, which is what are illustrated on the screen here. And they take account of the COVID pandemic, and that's the big drop you can see approximately in the middle. And then there are 3 colored scenarios. The first one in red is what we call business as usual, which is to go back to the post-pandemic production levels that were a previous trend of 2.9% increase a year. Then there's a sort of flat zero growth production level, and then a decline of 20%. And now the outcome of all of these scenarios is striking. By 2030, the number of new vehicles could be as high as 1.4 billion new vehicles over the next decade, on top of the previous 1.3 that I mentioned. And that's business as usual. Or just on flat growth, which would be unprecedented for the automobile industry, really. That's still around 971 million. And with 20% decline, which is a significant reduce in car dependency, which we've highlighted in green for sort of obvious reasons, that's still 858 million new vehicles over the decade. So whichever scenario comes closest to reality, one thing is abundantly clear, and maybe this is slightly not in contradiction, but maybe a contrast to what Professor Sachs was saying, is hundreds of millions of new vehicles will be joining the global fleet. And by the way, this is just 4-wheel vehicles. This chart doesn't include motorcycles. So we really have got a huge challenge over the next decade and beyond of how to simultaneously improve the quality of this global fleet and reduce car dependency. And so the question is, how are we going to do that? The Towards Zero Foundation, we're trying to encourage a coalition around an idea of Mission Zero 2050. And that will be trying to encourage a fundamental change of direction that aims to eliminate traffic deaths, both from crashes and pollution, and support carbon neutrality by 2050. And echoing the well-known phrase of Martin Luther King about the urgency of now, the key lesson is we have to take decisive action now. We need a quantitative and qualitative transition towards safe and sustainable transport. And to make this happen, we've got to take irreversible steps in the decade ahead. Last year, the UN General Assembly approved a new decade of action for road safety with a target to halve road deaths by 2030. And last week, which Professor Sachs already mentioned, the International Energy Agency released its roadmap to achieve net zero by 2050. Key milestones in there include that 60% of global car sales should be electric by 2030, and there should be an end to all internal combustion engine car sales by 2035. So for sure, we're facing the greatest disruption to our transport system since the origin of mass motorization 100 years ago. We are at the end of the ice age. And of course, it really is unacceptable to have a death toll of 1.3 million road crashes, road fatalities every year. Now, despite the scale of these challenges, I think there is grounds for optimism. There is, as Professor Sachs said, a sort of pathway that we can pursue. And one of the reasons is the technologies required for progress are already available. And the policy framework is also, I think, quite well known. This is the next slide. It's the avoid, shift, improve paradigm. This was originally developed by policymakers in Germany in the mid-1990s, particularly focusing on climate change. But it's relevant to the whole agenda of sustainable transport. And it's based on 3 pillars: to avoid risky and polluting travel. Secondly, to encourage a shift towards less dangerous and polluting travel modes. And thirdly, to mobilize technology that improves the safety of environment and performance of road transport. And I think this chart very neatly summarizes the different instruments and the overlaps between the 3 pillars there. I think also, though, we need, we can move to the next slide, we need a more human-centered approach, which inverts the traditional car-centric hierarchy that's dominated the thinking of transport planners for far too long. I think the combination of improved street design, lower speeds, better modal choice are essential if we're going to reduce car dependency. And giving primacy to the most vulnerable road users is the new imperative which can, if you like, power up the avoid, shift, improve paradigm. And that's what this diagram sort of asserts, that whereas the car has been until now the dominant feature, we want to completely reverse that agenda. And I think recognizing human vulnerability is the central part of this, because if we put that at the heart of our approach to transport planning, we get a completely different approach to road safety. We also get a different approach to the environmental aspects of sustainable transport. And so it's the application of systems thinking in sustainable transport that we think is critical, because it will give you an agenda of holistic structural adaptation. And that's going to be vital if we're going to make our mobility system much safer and less polluting by design. We can just pop back to the avoid, shift, improve slide for a moment. Now, in discussing the avoid, shift, improve paradigm, I think there is sometimes a reluctance to fully embrace the 3rd pillar, the improve pillar. And there is a kind of nervousness that technology improvement will undermine the other pillars. The sort of view that, well, if you really do improve, then there's no need to avoid. And there are concerns expressed, quite reasonable ones, that there are unintended consequences of efficiency improvements brought about by technological innovation. This is known as the Jevons paradox, named after an English economist who back in the 1860s observed that more efficient coal use led to increased demand. Now, there is some evidence that increased fuel efficiency can cause similar rebound effects. Another worry, and here I'm probably going to have a slightly different tenor than Professor Sachs, is there is a risk that sustainable transport falls prey to excessive hype of what I call techno-futurists. And unfortunately, I think this tendency is at its highest over wildly optimistic forecasts about the imminent arrival of driverless cars. Too often, automated vehicles have been offered as a kind of silver bullet that will simultaneously solve all the challenges of road transport. I'm not against driverless cars. I'm just deeply skeptical that they're going to be around anytime soon. And I think the hype around AVs is actually reducing somewhat as some of the enormous challenges and technical problems. I think they are showing some evidence where they would work in, it's true, in sort of highly geofenced particular modes, but the idea of mass use of AVs anytime soon, I think is very unlikely. And what we are seeing is that the complex challenging of delivering AVs at scale in real world conditions is leading to a much more realistic appraisal of their potential to solve real-world problems. And if you look at today's urgent challenges of road injury, air pollution, and climate change, what is absolutely the case is that they will be best tackled by today's best available technologies, the ones that are already available. But what they are not is fully deployed across global markets. And that's particularly important given the scale of increase in vehicle use around the world, particularly in middle-income countries. So in my opinion, the positive impact of AVs remains largely unproven, and even if it were to be established, it's going to be close to zero, at least for the decade ahead. So rather than dismiss or exaggerate the impact of technology, I think we need an approach that is realistic, but very positive. Nor should technology improvement be seen in isolation. Sometimes the pillar of technology is kind of separated out from the other, avoid and shifting. But that's really a mistake. Technology improvement can directly help us avoid unnecessary transport and encourage modal shift. And the challenge is to balance the mix of policy instruments so that the full benefits of technology are realized. And I think it's evident actually from our own event today. It's technology that is enabling us to have this whole event virtually. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. And so if you do have a problem of, say, rebound effects due to technology, well, use another policy instrument. You can reduce consumption, for example, by applying pay-as-you-go road pricing. And this kind of demand management is going to be vital across the whole of the avoid, shift, improve paradigm. And I think another point in parenthesis is that as the market share of electric vehicles surges, as night follows day, fiscal authorities are going to be looking afresh at road pricing to compensate for reduced fuel duties. So we're going to have to get used to the idea of being charged differently for the way that we drive. So for the Towards Zero Foundation, promoting technology transition is going to be a key focus of ours over the next decade. And as I explained earlier, the production scenario shows, I think, very strongly why. Even with our sort of green scenario of a 20% reduction, we still will see 800 million new vehicles on the roads. So the immediate future that we want is all of them to be as safe and as clean as possible using today's best available technologies. But this will face significant obstacles, some of which are particular characteristics of the global auto industry. Over the last 100 years, automotive manufacturing has suffered from very stubborn path dependency. For a variety of reasons, there's been strong inertial resistance to change direction. The very dominance of internal combustion engines was established early in the history of the automobile. And this has only really been disrupted very recently by the combination of public policy demands over air pollution and climate crisis, and also by the self-inflicted scandal of Dieselgate, which exposed blatant disregard for environmental regulations. And this has been the kind of tipping point that has really brought to the end of its life the internal combustion engine. I think also one has to be blunt about this. There has been for many years industry-wide practice of deny, deflect, and delay, slowing the introduction of technologies, whether it's for emissions control or safety. And this tendency has a long history in high-income countries going back to the 1960s, and the list goes on and on, is sort of resisting basic crash standards, resisting airbags, resisting catalytic converters, all sorts of technologies. And we see that negative influence just as active today in emerging markets, where very often markets that are not well regulated, the number one antagonists we face are industry associations saying, not yet, or you don't need to do this. But now, is it possible to overcome this path dependency and accelerate deployment of best available technology? And my answer is definitely yes to this. We can just skip 2 slides forward. Sorry, one further back. Sorry. Next one. Oh, there we go. That one. Sorry. I think I've got the order of my slides slightly wrong here. And so what I'm saying, my answer is yes, provided we really understand the nature of which innovation and deployment occurs. There is an oversimplistic view of innovation, which is it's a linear process, a sort of path from pure science into products in the market. And it requires a sort of genius at one end and an entrepreneur at the other, and all will be well. But actually, the reality is much, much more complex than that. There's a whole process of feedback loops and dynamic interaction of public policy, innovation, consumer demand, and regulation. This chart tries to sort of illustrate that. I'm sorry, it's probably a bit too small to see, but inside the feedback loop, you've got public policy with key goals there. You've got the pure science phase and innovation. Then you've got the development from prototypes into real products, into deployment. And you've also got the whole regulatory push. And very often there are bottlenecks. Very often you find that, for instance, advanced technology are going to be introduced only in the luxury end of vehicles and not feed through to the smaller vehicle classes. And it takes some disruption, some other activity to break open the market and really accelerate penetration of key technologies. And that's why the whole process is more complex and involves the interaction of different agents, including consumers, including government regulation. I rather agree with Matthew Sachs's command and control kind of preferences there. It simply doesn't happen by market forces alone. And the agent of change is very often the creative energy generated on the one hand by demand pull and the other by regulatory push. And demand pull is the work we kind of do, where we stage crash tests and things that dramatize the difference between vehicles. And that definitely accelerates consumer interest in safer products. And that kind of work that Global NCAP has done has accelerated market availability of safer systems and increased competition between the manufacturers. So I think that's very much the process that we want to see at work over the next decade. By the way, our practical experience on all this strongly supports the work of Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's at the Institute of Innovation and Public Policy at University College London, who talks about the benefits of so-called mission-orientated policy. That's very much our experience. Now, I appreciate that the idea of achieving zero road fatalities and emissions by 2050 is extremely ambitious. But again, I think I'm very much at one with Professor Sachs. If we can go back a slide, I've got my order on there. I think to translate the vision into reality, we need to mobilize this purpose-driven mission. And this needs the dynamic use of roadmaps, targets, and applied through a methodology which is referred to as backcasting. And this takes as its starting point the end vision. So you start where the cloud is there with the vision, whatever it may be, in our case, zero deaths and zero emissions. And then you then ask not what can be done, but what must be done to reach the goal. And this then requires a much stronger framework of leadership commitment, public and stakeholder engagement. But I think if you succeed in mobilizing that, you're far more likely to succeed. And you have these predictable sort of hop, skips, and jumps on the path towards your vision. Now, I think, can we get this done? Well, I think we can. If you take, as a practical example, in the area of vehicle safety, which we've done a lot of work in, the World Health Organization has established a set of road safety performance indicators, which include vehicles. And they propose that 100% of new and used vehicles should meet the most important UN minimum safety standards by 2030. Some people are surprised when I say this. They say, well, don't they do that already? Well, unfortunately not. And if, in fact, this happened, we reckon probably 1/3 of all road traffic deaths would be eliminated, and you'd be well on the path towards zero. Now, can we get this done? The decision-making target is not that difficult to identify. We can move to a next slide. That's it. That's the one. Now, although safer vehicles is a shared concern of 200 UN member states, it is actually the G20. You know, I asked Professor Sachs a question about this. The G20 account for 85% of all passenger car production, and they host the top 10 vehicle manufacturers. So they are the countries and they are the leaders that have the most influence over the automotive world. And what this chart shows, it looks like a sort of box of sweets. I won't won't go into great detail, but each colored car represents one of the most important UN regulations. And then what you have on the left is the production with China up at the top there. And you'll see that not everybody, in fact, only the EU has actually got a colored vehicle in every box. And some are pretty alarming. So you've got Mexico with great big gaps down, Indonesia just one, which means that they have an active NCAP program, but no regulations at all. What we want to see is this entire chart all colored full. And that would then mean you have a full suite of all the most important regulations, so pedestrian protection, child restraints, motorcycle anti-lock brakes, and there's a list there. So that is the challenge. In a way, it's quite a straightforward one. You have an agenda for 2030, you need some command and control regulations, get on and do it. And that's what we're saying they should be doing. They should be working together in the UN body that manages global vehicle regulations. They should all benefit from consumer testing by NCAPs, and they should all apply the most important vehicle regulations. And we're hoping that the G20, which is under the Italian presidency this year in October, might start to address some of these issues. It's one pathway along this Mission Zero 2050 agenda. And much more action is going to be needed to reduce car dependency and hit net zero carbon. So I think the G20 must take very seriously the IEA's call for 60% EV sales by 2030 and an ICE ban by 2035. It's one area where the UK has actually moved in the right direction with a policy like that. There is a very powerful case, I believe, for a joint agenda of G20 cooperation to promote this kind of historic transition. As the IEA report makes very clear, the full electrification that we need requires further progress in battery development, installation of charging infrastructure on a new scale, improvements in grid capacity, and above all, green electricity generation. So there's a huge agenda of improvement in that avoid, shift, improve paradigm we need to see. And I strongly agree with Jeffrey Sachs's perspective that this is an area where we all gain. We should try and avoid this becoming an area of competitive sort of rivalry between nations. We need competitive, cooperative work between the countries. And the G20 does have this clear agenda. And I think they also must signal clearly to industry that this is the direction of travel to follow. And as I said before, we've got to move beyond this tradition in the industry of deny, deflect, and delay. And that tradition risks, it still exists. There's still, just in the last couple of months, 2 major CEOs of car companies have expressed doubts about electrification. And the danger is that they're going to look like they're leading an industry of dinosaurs. On the other hand, there are positive signs that some manufacturers are embracing this agenda. They're committing to zero emissions and zero fatalities. Volvo recently announced, interestingly, that it will set a maximum speed for all its vehicles not above 140 kilometers an hour. And I think that is the kind of recognition that building cars capable of speeds far above maximum speed limits is a kind of gross waste of engineering ability. But excess capacity is also a macro issue for the auto industry. For if we succeed in reducing car dependency, then it's more likely that volumes of global car production will indeed decline. Now, this will be very challenging for industry and governments alike. Pre-COVID, at the time of record levels of production, we estimate that the industry's plant utilization was only running at around 70%. So even at the peak production, it was still about 30% unused. The fact is that there just is a structural excess capacity. And this will have to be tackled at the same time as the world enters the age of electromobility. And so to avoid the risk of extinction, the auto industry for sure has no alternative but to restructure and re-engineer as never before. And I think that is going to be a big challenge for the G20 leadership as well. And it all points towards greater cooperation rather than destructive competition. So to sum up at the end, if the G20 got fully behind Mission Zero 2050, where would that leave the motor vehicle? I mean, I think it would be much safer and cleaner. It would be mainly electric, equipped with advanced driver assistance systems that make crashes much rarer. It will automatically follow the speed limit, and it will mostly still, sorry to disappoint Professor Zach, be under the control of a human driver. Pay-as-you-go charging will be widespread. Levels of usage will be significantly less as car dependency is reduced. But then we will enjoy the benefits of living in more human-centered, livable communities where walking and cycling is just as common as driving a car. Overall, the motor vehicle will have a prominent but less dominant role in a much safer and sustainable mobility system. And that is the future that I hope our Mission Zero 2050 will bring. Thanks very much.
David, thank you very, very much. As always, extremely enlightening. There's one question in the chat, but I'm going to put my own spin on it, if I may. You know, given this history of, you called it what, delay, deny, deflect, and delay, and what you see is the need for the contraction of an industry that's already at overcapacity. Professor Sachs made the, I would say, the non-economic argument that regulation is what's necessary. You can't really rely on the market. You talked about cooperation. You also mentioned the G20 having to solve or step in to get the kind of cooperation that would lead to a contraction, so that the individual automobiles are actually at the bottom of that inverted pyramid, as you said. Is it really necessary for governments to step in here, or can the industry sort it out on its own in a sense?
Well, there is no track record of the industry sorting it out on its own. And I would say even now, I mean, the very move towards electrification is entirely driven by public pressure and by governments. And it's quite interesting that if you look at the origins of Dieselgate, it was a small research lab in West Virginia, funded by ICCT, a very impressive global NGO, a $70,000 project to find out why VWs are apparently coping with emission standards that the company was saying was impossible in Europe, that led to the exposure of them blatantly cheating. So, you know, this is an industry that needs a carrot and a stick. And I think that is what's worked. I mean, the model I was showing, my little circular diagram there, is really showing that it's this combination of a regulatory push on the one hand and demand pull. You do have to have products that people want to buy, and you've got to inform the consumer. And the work that we've done through Global NCAP has shown the power of consumer information independent testing to generate market demand. And I think those mechanisms are still what we need to see. And I suppose one way of looking at all of this is that we're trying to build a new market for electric mobility as ICE mobility is shrunk. And we've got to face the fact that there are going to be capacity challenges in all of this, that there is too much investment. We're over-invested in ICE structures, and we're going to have to go much more for EVs. There will be a shakeout. There always is. And if you look over the last history of 100 years, look how few manufacturing car manufacturers there are now. There's enormous consolidation going on. I think part of this is a big political problem here, which is that, you know, I'm sure if you had every head of the G20 country there, that all say they want a dynamic and viable car industry. Well, you know, we have to be, I think, much more sensible about, and actually also regionalized. We need to modernize and turn the automotive industry into an electromobility industry in a way which all regions benefit, and have that sort of benefits of scale. But there will be a shakeout, and the politics of that will have to be managed. And it's going to be awkward issues around plants closing and jobs and then reskilling and so on. So there's no question there's a big industrial restructuring challenge that is faced.
And of course, the same is true of the oil industry that provides the fuel for the current fleet. Yet neither you nor Professor Sachs actually really mentioned the role of the incumbent energy industry. He talked about electrification, of course. Any reflections on, you know, as the IRP looks ahead into the future of mobility, what do you see as the path for The oil industry in this case, not the oil and gas.
Well, you're 100% right, and I mean, if I had more time, I would have. But the IEA report is very clear about this. It says no new investment in finding new fossil fuel resources. You know, freeze the whole thing. And I think what is interesting is I've detected, like Shell and various others, some of the major investors in these companies are criticizing them for still relying too much on future fossil fuel discovery and innovation. And so we're starting to see very significant financial pressures on these companies to look towards renewables and invest in renewables. And I think that's going to be a powerful engine of change there. And then getting into the electromobility marketplace, which is, I think, they will do. But for sure, it's all of this is it's a sort of unprecedented re-engineering of our transport system, on a par with how it started out just over 100 years ago. So it's a pretty radical agenda of change we're going to have to face over the next decade, and it will be really significantly starting this decade. This is the time of action that we're going to see if we're going to have any hope of meeting net zero carbon by 2050.
Yeah, and a radical transformation that must proceed in parallel with other radical transformations, so all the more complicated. So those of you who are in the virtual audience, in a sense, please do send some questions for David. This is the best opportunity we have to peer into the future of mobility.
Just while you're waiting, I would pay huge tribute to the work that Rob de Jong and your colleagues are doing at UNEP in the headquarters there. I mean, the whole campaign around Streets for Life and better urban design, and absolutely brilliant, because that's going to be one of the key pathways, alongside the technology changes within the auto industry and the oil industry, is just redesigning our cities. That's going to be essential.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I will pass that along to Rob. It is a good program, a good team, and I've always been pleasantly surprised by the pickup of the messages that they're delivering, and the enthusiasm in the countries with whom that group is working. You could easily see it as being kind of dismissed as, oh, this is a different approach. It's not really been applied in developed countries. Why are you trying to foist off this new approach on us? But kudos to them. Victor, do we have any questions that have come in, or has the technology failed us?
I don't know about the technology. In any case, I don't see any new questions coming up in the chat.
Oh, there are two.
Oh, there are.
I see a couple. I've managed to encourage people. Go ahead, read them off for David. Or three.
Sure.
No, they're like a ticker tape now.
Sure. So, what's the role of the government, Mr. Ward, in encouraging the electric cars? So that is the first question that we're seeing. And what is your view on ownership models? Should, for example, carpooling be tax incentivized over private ownership? And if I may also just pull an IRP spin on that last question about carpooling. Recently, the IRP did a report that found that a lot of the energy savings and CO2 reductions, emission reductions, can come from things like carpooling, ride sharing, in the use phase rather than in the production phase. So we were wondering what are your views on that and how that can be achieved? Thank you.
Sure. So as we've touched on, I think the role of governments in EVs is going to be absolutely critical, and it's a hugely enabling role, because we are co-creating a new marketplace, and in order to give the consumer confidence to switch to EVs, there are a whole series of things that need to happen. I mean, first of all, there is at the moment, although I think over the next 5-6 years this will reduce, there is a cost barrier that EVs are more expensive, at least at point of purchase. In fact, the lifetime use cost is less, but people tend to concentrate on the upfront cost. So there's a case, as Norway has been the most aggressive, having fiscal incentives to encourage people to switch. Then absolutely vital is going to be charging infrastructure. If you've made the switch to EVs, but then you find it's extremely difficult to charge the vehicle in a similar sort of way that we're used to with petrol vehicles, petrol and diesel, then we're going to have a big problem. And then in parallel, we've got to make sure that all this is the electricity generated is green, and that it can be delivered efficiently through the grid. Now, in all aspects of that, governments have a very key role, setting regulation, providing incentives, and kind of holding the hand of industry as they move forward in this way. And I think without very, very strong commitment from government, this simply won't happen. So, but I would include in that this subtle process of how do we convince the consumer of where we're going to go. And that's where I'm being a bit selfish here. There's a plug for consumer-oriented organizations that that demonstrate and test out the validity of industry claims, because there's a big trust gap these days. Dieselgate was a dramatic collapse caused a dramatic collapse in trust of what car manufacturers say. There's a lot of trust issues with government too. So you need an independent voice to be able to verify what's going on in this whole process. Sort of watchdog role, if you like, which ICC, for example, is a wonderful example of. On the question of ownership, I must admit I love the idea of rideshare. Well, they're kind of related, these ones. On ownership, I think people will still want to own cars, and I understand in urban environments, in cities, as Jeffrey Sachs said, there's plenty of examples of people not needing them. But in terms of people's life cycles, there are definitely periods, young families with children, etc., where vehicles are an attractive option. And we may not like it, but the class of vehicles that have grown the fastest over the last 20 years has been SUVs. Now, SUVs are liked because they're very good family vehicles. They're very versatile in that kind of usage. And I don't think that's going to go away. The other thing is we may be, post-COVID, facing a kind of slight reversal of the drive towards ever-increasing urbanization. More opportunities for people to live out of the center of cities, different work patterns and so on, where I think vehicle ownership may become quite attractive again. So I don't think personally we're going to see a huge drop-off in the desire for ownership. Certainly if you look at the emerging markets, you look at China, India, places like that, there's no sign of that. Particularly younger people, they aspire to vehicle ownership. I think what we have to try and do is separate ownership from usage. And let's let them buy cars if they must, keep them parked outside their house, but use them less. And I know it's sort of paradox. You always get these examples of how vehicles are used tiny percent of the time. Well, yes, but let's concentrate on using less, reducing car dependency, than trying to stop ownership. And that leads me into the carpooling, ride sharing. I think, yes, that is appealing, particularly in city environments. But I do worry post-COVID whether there's a degree of we have to just confront the fact that people like their own space, they like their own messes. They, when you're carpooling, you're using a vehicle in a different way, and in a way, the best kind of ride sharing and pooling, I still think, is good old-fashioned buses and public transport. And so I worry actually that in the mix we emphasize carpooling and ride sharing, where in fact we should be really pushing a big push back towards traditional public transport, which has faced a huge COVID crisis. And we've really got to restore confidence and the viability of mass transit.
So David, I don't know if you can look at the chat, but now we're getting a kind of a flood of good questions. So get ready. Victor, what do you want to tee up next?
So I wanted to start with a more social question and then going into the more political/technical ones. The first one is, because I'm in Paris, I am using public transportation every day. And how could we avoid effects such as those of the yellow vests? That is, backlash to taxing car fuels. Would it, for example, be offering better or cheaper public transport at the same time at increasing fuel costs? So that is one question. And then we also have other questions. One is, do you have a view on the EU industrial strategy and the announced roadmaps for industrial ecosystems in the European Union? And finally, how can the fleets of internal combustion engine vehicles be electrified, or at least contribute to accelerating, I guess, engine vehicles widespread?
Sorry, the last one, I didn't quite get the last one.
Sure. So the last one is, how can the fleets of internal combustion engine vehicles be electrified, or at least contribute to accelerating EV widespread?
Yeah, as I read it, maybe the question is more a question of not how can, but is it possible to kind of convert? Is that how you read it, Victor?
I
Can
think
the
that is the intent, yes.
of internal combustion engine vehicles be electrified, or at least contribute to accelerating the spread of EVs? Do you have to recycle, or recycle to manufacture new parts and bodies? Are existing fleets convertible, in other words?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so yeah, yellow vests. We had the same. There were back in the UK. I'm trying to remember exactly when this was. There were fuel duty protests, the same sort of thing, and then it became very intense in France. This requires very careful political management, and I think that over time EVs will be shown to be highly affordable, and the cost of purchase, especially the cost of use, will be less. So that should begin to reduce this tension. And I also tend to believe, as I've hinted at my earlier contribution, I strongly believe in road pricing. I think road pricing is intrinsically more effective and fairer, potentially fairer system of taxing vehicles. It can be done in a way where you penalize or you make the road pricing system more progressive in such a way that some communities are not clearly disadvantaged. For example, fuel taxes at the moment are really very regressive. People who live in rural communities, who have less access to public transport and who drive the longest distances, pay the most in fuel taxes. So they're highly sensitive to increases in fuel taxes. Whereas the rich kid in his Ferrari driving down the King's Road in Chelsea in London, So I would reorganize road pricing so that you'd actually make it easier for people in rural communities who have much more limited choice. But if somebody wants to drive a Ferrari down the King's Road, you charge them the highest possible rate imaginable. Probably they'd pay it happily, because driving down the road in a Ferrari is kind of what they want to show everybody. It's their status symbol. So I think handling the fiscal side of all of this requires great subtlety and carefulness, but we've got to make sure that fairness underpins that transition. I think that answers the question, but it's by far the hardest politically. On the EU, I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about the EU industrial strategy anymore. I'm a very sad, no longer EU member. I do think the EU is and continues to play a very powerful role in technology change in the automobile sector. And if looking back at my chart of all the most important vehicle standards, you'll see that the EU is the one that ticked all the boxes. So it has been and continues to be an absolutely central force in the second largest vehicle market in the world after China. On the other hand, its track record over the fallout from Dieselgate wasn't great. In fact, the bias in favor of diesels was a kind of inadvertent mistake of EU policy back in the 1990s, where they made a very serious mistake, which is that they allowed diesels to have less stringent tailpipe emissions than petrol, because at the time they were sort of motivated probably by a good instinct, is that diesels were reckoned to be more fuel efficient, hence less CO2. So this bias in terms of less stringent standards, and then sometimes supported by a fiscal incentive, led to a huge increase in dieselization of the European market, with very bad effects on air quality as a consequence. And this was a big mistake. So the EU needs to learn lessons from that. And I think technology neutrality around these sort of standards is what should have happened back then. But I do think that on EVs, they need to lead the way. And I sort of support Jeffrey Sachs' point that we need, I think, a common position across the EU of shifting to a ban on ICE by 2035 would be a positive thing. Finally, now the issue of fleets and ICE, I think part of the issue is the transition is, are the vehicle platforms used for internal combustion engines easily adaptable to EVs? The answer to that is, I think, sort of yes. Quite a lot of the initial EVs are based around the same kind of vehicle platforms. I mean, for instance, the latest Volvo EV is essentially the same vehicle platform, but just converted. What's interesting is that EVs offer a completely different engineering architecture. They don't tend to have a great lump of metal up early in the front of the vehicle. They more have a sort of skateboard look, and you can spread the weight. They tend to be heavier, and you can spread the weight more evenly. This offers the prospect in the future of much better energy management in crash scenarios. You can direct the energy much better. So there is going to be an opportunity with the new generation of EVs that they will probably be safer than ever before, particularly actually in pedestrian impacts, because you'll be able to have much softer fronts and more crushable structure before you hit anything hard. So there are kind of interesting opportunities where EVs eventually may be shown to be safer than conventional internal combustion engines. So that's quite an interesting engineering opportunity. I mean, you cannot retrofit in the sense of, you know, once you've got an internal combustion engine in there. And of course, hybrids are there's a sort of, the jury is out a bit on hybrids, but they've been a very important transition. And we all remember back in the mid-90s when Toyota came out with the Prius, but they've actually done very well as a transition to full EVs. And I think they are still important. They're going to be important, particularly, I think, in some emerging markets where the prospect of an outright ban on internal combustion engines is probably politically not viable. But overall, I think you know, the prospects for a successful transition to EVs, provided we get the infrastructure right and the charging side of it and the generation side of it, then I think we will have a very bright new electromobility future.
Great. Victor, two more questions, both from Julia. Why don't we give them to David as a pair, and that'll probably take us to the end of the session.
Of course. So, Mr. Ward, earlier you alluded to the idea of restructuring our cities together with the transport system. So just to continue with the issue of EVs, how much policy attention and money should go into supporting EV transition versus investing into the wider transport systems in things such as buses, urban and distance trains, as well as cycling with everything that's cycling lanes and so on. And in cities like London, Paris, and so on that already have a very comprehensive public transport system, how do you further improve these very crowded, sometimes, transport systems to further reduce the need for private vehicles?
Well, I think a very important thing is the electrification of public transport vehicles. And that is what you'll see is buses and delivery vehicles and the full gamut of public utility service-related vehicles switching to electric propulsion. And I don't think that it's not an either or, it should all be at one and the same time. And you know, we've got this challenge in cities is you want to make them as human-centered as possible, but of course you still got to have some service vehicles servicing the retail outlets and the other operations, the other activities going on in the city. So that's why I keep emphasizing earlier this sort of systems approach. None of this is one thing only. And I think what is encouraging about this is provided you stick to the backcasting sort of roadmap that I described, provided there is some real tough decision making and sticking to deadlines, then actually over a 30-year period, this is not as dramatic as it looks. I mean, a lot of change happens over that period. There's a lot of investment anyway going on in replacing vehicles or in redesigning streets and so on. This is more about thinking about this the whole time so that it's integrated fully into, if you like, a normal kind of care and maintenance modernization program. But I think we've got to keep them all together and recognize that there are big improvements in technology that will help across the piece. And I'm for that, I mean, for instance, great efficiencies in transport systems of just door-to-door information knowing, ticketing and commuting information. We want to have a seamless transport experience, which encourages people not to opt for private cars as much as possible. And where vehicles are inevitably going to be used, we want to max out the technologies that really minimize the risk of injury. And a technology which the EU is just about to apply is intelligent speed assistance. From next July, it'll be rolled out over a number of years, but all vehicles, including vans and trucks and so on, will have a system where the vehicle essentially obeys the speed limit. And it can be overridden and so on, but that will be a huge transition, like a massive traffic calming exercise. After the majority of the vehicles, or even just a third of the vehicles on the road, so by 2030, say, something like a third of the vehicles in Europe will have ISA systems. It'll be like a huge traffic calming exercise. And again, some cities don't have to wait. London, Transport for London are now fitting ISA into all of their buses. They've actually got them into about 25% or something of their bus fleet. Mm-hmm. And they've had overall already an 80% reduction in injuries, which is quite impressive. And that's the sort of injuries where buses are going too fast, they have to brake very hard, people fall over, as well as horrible ones where they collide with bicyclists and so on. So my plea is to try and do all of this together, but in a planned rollout on a multi-year, multi-decade program.
And maybe the second question, David, there, I think we still have just a few more minutes. I would phrase it as follows. The attention of governments is limited, I think is how Julia put it. Where the balance in supporting the EV transition versus investing in buses, urban, or maybe you answered that in part, but did you wish to comment a little bit more? Like, you're in government, you're deciding where do you throw the policy effort and the money, the investment?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if in a place like London, you've got to have big cooperation between. I mean, the power of cities have a big ability to influence their fleets, yeah. And they should be doing all of this. Probably they will really need a lot of help from central government and alongside from other parts of industry to make sure that the charging infrastructure is there. And again, I come back to the same, but that's kind of a system approach. You've got to look at this from all ends, and you've got to mobilize progress simultaneously, because there will be huge setbacks if user experience gets frustrated by a failure to follow through with charging infrastructure. And it seems to me that everyone, all the stakeholders have got to play their part, all of them. And in a way that comes back to this backcasting roadmap idea. This isn't any one sector's exclusive domain. We've got to work together to deliver.
And final question. I know I said, but another interesting one came in that I had been thinking about myself. And I started by saying that reminding the participants that the IRP looks at resource flows over the life cycle and such. So EVs have a decidedly different composition than a typical internal combustion engine vehicle, particularly for the battery components. Have you looked at or given any thought about the implications of, let's say, increased demand for metals like lithium or cobalt, nickel?
I must say we haven't, but I'm aware of those studies and the sensitivities around all of that, and there are very serious concerns about the concentration of access to some of these resources to a certain number of countries with maybe rather major human rights issues and so on. So there are challenges around all of that, for sure. But in a sense, there's nothing new about that. I mean, it's not as though oil hasn't generated a lot of difficulties in the world in the past. So I think there's no avoiding difficult issues and tackling them. And I think what will be helped is big improvements in efficiency, which I think will come about in batteries. And more generally, EVs have far fewer components. So aside from the battery issues, they're much simpler vehicles. So maintenance costs, et cetera, should be much less.
Good point. So David, thank you again. As always, very, very interesting, thought-provoking, and in my experience, once again, delivered with a sort of an infectious enthusiasm that you bring to any of these sorts of sessions. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah. For those of you who have joined us today, I thank you all in the audience for sending in good questions. I'd like to remind everyone that this series of webcast continues. The next session, I should say, will be on energy and climate change, which will be this coming Thursday, the 27th of May at 1 p.m. Central European Time. If you are interested, please check the International Resource Panel website for additional information on that event and on the others in the series. So thank you again for joining us, and David, again, thanks for such an interesting presentation. Goodbye, everybody. That concludes today, and bye-bye.